Continuing on in chapter 1 here today. In the last lesson, we began with the introduction, the incipit, as we covered with that word, of this letter, the first 5 verses. Now we transition into the following 5, verses 6 through 10, which is what we'll cover today. The primary purpose of this particular subsection is then Paul's outlining, after having given an introduction, the purpose of the letter. Again, it's following a very routine, normal, well and widely understood formatting of a letter, particularly a more formal letter in the ancient Hellenistic world, or Greco-Roman world more broadly. There is one interesting detail here that we'll get into when we just after we've read the text that I'll explain. But this particular subsection obviously and naturally sets the scene and lays the foundation for what then comes throughout the rest of this particular letter, of course, and really it is an expounding of this core fundamental issue that he is herein highlighting that we'll look at today. Okay, so let's read the passage and then we'll commence. So, Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 to 10. I marvel that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to the gospel that we have proclaimed to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so I now say again, if any man is proclaiming to you a gospel contrary to what you received, let him be accursed. For am I now seeking the favour of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I was still trying to please men, I would not be a slave to Christ. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I mentioned in the introduction there is this letter is following already a fairly standard model of letter in this particular time period of the first century in the Greco-Roman world. However, there is one detail here that is a very glaring omission on Paul's part as compared to the customary way in which he would write in other letters. Normally and customarily, Paul, in every other letter that he writes, even to the Colossians, which is dealing with serious issues of Gnosticism and other such things, he reminds or really gives a salutation to the recipients, be it the Colossians, the Philippians, Thessalonians, etc., thanking God for them and informing / reminding them of how he often prays for them regularly and other such things. Even if I just briefly give you the one such example from Philippians, in Philippians chapter 1, that particular book begins with Paul and Timothy, slaves of Christ, because this book of Philippians is written by Paul along with Timothy, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the overseers, i.e. bishops or elders, and deacons, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. We saw that in our lesson last time. Verse 3, I thank my God in all my remembrances of you, always offering prayer with joy in all my prayers for you. Okay? And then continues on with phraseology along those lines. So I thank my God in all my remembrance for you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for all of you. That's verse 3, right? And that's routine across the other letters.
Is that a refinement because this is the first one, or you think he's just refined his intro?
So yes, good question. Some have speculated of it being a refinement. Most, however, based on the broader literary context, make the point that I'll now make here, which is that there is a distinct tone to this letter that a demarcation,
Yeah.
not entirely, but certainly majorly from other letters. In Colossians, which is suffering that the churches of Colossae with the Gnostic cults, the Gnostic mystery cults, and Gnosticism. He's obviously dealing with serious matters there. However, he makes a salutation to them as well. In this particular instance here, he does not do that. Instead, dives right into the source and actually does so, especially in his first sentence, with sarcasm. In this instance, he does not mention how he prays for them, although, of course, naturally we know and assume he would have. He doesn't mention about how much he cares about them, although, of course, the very writing of this letter indicates clearly that he does care about them, otherwise he wouldn't be bothering to waste his time. But there's no mentioning of that because in the instance or the subject matter at hand, the time for niceties is far gone. Is in essence the conclusion of the broader reading.
Maybe it's the impact value too, jumping straight into it.
Correct, there could be that also as well, yes. So he begins in verse 6 by saying this: I marvel that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ. To marvel here, again, it's a word that's relatively, it's more common in the Gospels, for example. When people marvel at the various different miracles that Christ performed is usually the context you find that in. It's a sense of astonishment, of awe, of wonder, and again, there's a variety of different contexts in which that word canon is used in the scriptures and in other Hellenistic literature. In this case, though, it's a matter of, in one sense, it's obviously truthful, but in one sense it's serious, in another sense it's sarcastic. So in one sense he's genuinely marveling in a bewildered kind of way as to how quickly those
But even today we can see that's a sarcastic use of the word.
Correct, yeah. But it's the sarcasm that's rather evident. And so I marvel that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ. This word of desertion is, again, a familiar term in his time. To desert here is speaking of one who changes sides, essentially, who abandons, who transitions or moves from one thing to another. Again, there's a semantic range to how this word is applied. In this case, desertion is really the most direct way of probably phrasing it. Abandoning, you could also say as well, I suppose, in English, that would fit within the semantic domain of the word. But to desert, he's speaking of treason. He's speaking of treachery. He's speaking of deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ. Him, of course, being a reference is God. What's interesting here, and again, he explains for a different gospel, which is really not another. We'll get into that later. But the first port of call here in this opening verse 6 is the object, really, of the sentence, namely him. It's a deserting of him who called you by the grace of Christ. Whilst, of course, this opening passage and much of the rest of the book is focused on the gospel and the notion of the good news, the evangelion, the fact that God has come in the flesh, that he has walked among men, that he has died and been buried and been raised from the dead as a sacrifice and an atonement for our sin to redeem us from death and from judgment, etc., etc., etc. Whilst, of course, the gospel is in a very close view here in this book, the ultimate object of the abandonment, the ultimate thing or person who has been abandoned, in this case it's a person, is actually God himself, right? It is Christ himself. So it's not just merely you have, and this is an important distinction to understand, really, really important. This is not the only place in the scriptures that are like this. In fact, this concept is all over the Old Testament, left, right, and centre. And it's almost equally plenary across the New Testament as well. In this instance, the Galatians are not merely abandoning an idea. Okay, they're not simply abandoning. They're not abandoning a creed or a belief, although they are by extension, obviously. That's not primarily and foundationally what is being abandoned, because what is being abandoned is actually a who. Okay, it's a whom is being abandoned. In this case, it is God. There is a personal element to this. Okay, it's not detached from that. Every time that that you see in the Old Testament where the Israelites are rightfully chastised for their covenant unfaithfulness, for their abandonment of the covenant, for their breaking of the covenant, it is almost invariably and inevitably founded upon God explaining through mostly the prophets, "You have abandoned me." Okay, God telling them, "You have abandoned me." It's not just merely this abstract idea that is the covenant. The covenant is between people. There is a personal element. Obviously, we've touched on a lot of those things in our sermon series on Deuteronomy on Sundays as we've been going through, especially those early chapters, and even into where we are. So much of that, of course, Deuteronomy is is one of the primary sources about God as making covenant with us as people. The covenant and a whole notion of a covenant between elements is a covenant between people. It's not just merely an intellectual assent to abstract ideas. We live in a time where society is heavily built upon and dependent upon intellectual assent in one form or another to whatever degree of commitment to a set of abstract ideals. We have this in political context, economic context, social context, etc. It's entirely impersonal and actually depersonalized. The biblical worldview and the biblical framework is vastly different from our modern secular conceptualization of these things. It's entirely personalized and personified even, especially at the core essence of the gospel, which is the word becoming flesh. Okay, it is why the Christian calendar revolves around the axis of Advent and Christmas. Okay, you don't get to Holy Week. That is to say, you don't get to Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday. You don't get there without having gone through Christmas, because there is no death, burial, and resurrection without the incarnation first. The incarnation is the primary thing that is foretold and looked forward to in the Old Testament. The sacrifice of Christ is all over the place, especially in Isaiah, but it's really the incarnation. It's God coming and dwelling among his people, which is the primary thing that's actually looked forward to, because without that there is nothing else of that gospel. There is no Christ physically dying upon the cross if Christ is not physically here in the first place. Do you know what I mean? And so there is a deeply personal essence. It's a significant demarcation between Christianity and the modern religions. The ancient pagan religions, of course, had actually, ironically, had far more personal elements than the modern religions. When I say ancient and modern, I'm talking essentially BC versus AD, right? I'm talking about the time prior to and the time after Christ. The ancient pagan religions had more of a personal element. Of course, each in any society or any civilization, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, whoever, all had a pantheon of gods that served the needs of men and to whom men were subservient and served in return. Every household and every family would have a personal deity whose devotion really took up most of their time. If they were a fisherman, or if they were a politician, or if they were a lawyer, or whatever happened to be. So there was ironically more personal elements in the modern religions. It's greatly and deeply depersonalized, and that's especially the case in the Oriental religions. So that of especially things like Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, although it's a little bit less in Shintoism with ancestor worship. But it's largely, especially really obvious cases like Buddhism, it is entirely a depersonalized religion. There is no central personal being that is God in the way that there is in the conception of Christianity. There is the more generic pantheistic or even panentheistic deity of all things, and the kind of universe itself being divine. And then, of course, you have the Eightfold Path, and it's an ascent to conceptual abstract ideas. It's deeply inhuman, which is one of its many problems. But the point being drawn here is to get us all to understand and to see why this kind of concept is so important. The distortion, which is the word that gets used shortly, more on that in a minute, of the gospel, the abandonment of the gospel, to use his words, deserting of the gospel is really not only, or actually even foundationally, a deserting of a paradigm or an idea, although it is that by extension. It's actually a deserting of a person. It's a deserting of God, right, of Christ. When we violate the gospel, when we distort the gospel, when we abandon the gospel, whatever it happens to be, it is treason. It's treachery. It's a breaking of oaths that have been sworn. There are multiple reasons why historically the baptism and communion have been referred to as sacraments, coming out of the Western Latin tradition, and one of those is that original word of sacramentum means an oath. Okay, it's a Roman soldier, a Roman legionnaire, upon enlisting, would take a sacramentum. He would swear an oath of loyalty to his commanding officers, to his centurions, his tribunes, his legates, etc. He would swear an oath to defend Rome, to protect Rome, and to advance Rome. It's a swearing of an oath, and it was binding because oaths are and should be.
It's interesting that it's not sworn to Caesar, though; it's actually to Rome.
Yes, correct. And how that evolves a certain way in the imperial period, which is a much more complex lesson about how things operated prior to and after Augustus. But yes, Rome is what's in view. And so there's a personal element. So the sacrament, the swearing of an oath. Our baptism is an oath, and our ongoing partaking and participation in Holy Communion is the ongoing demonstration and commitment of that oath, among many other things, of course, which are inherent in those sacraments. To desert him, but again, both of those things of baptism and of communion are likewise entirely personalized. It is the washing of regeneration in our spirit by the Holy Spirit, okay, that is connected to baptism. It's not we're not washed. It's not a washing of the dirt from the body, as the Apostle Peter says, but of the appeal to heaven of a good conscience, right? In other words, of the righteousness of Christ. We've preached on that before, actually. It's the sign, the visible sign, baptism in water, which is a sign of that which is signified. In other words, the underlying spiritual action on the part of God. Same with communion. Of course, in the Reformed Protestant tradition, we reject the more novel Roman doctrine of transubstantiation for a variety of reasons. But that which is the sign, the bread and the wine, whilst being material, finite elements, nevertheless Christ is present there, because indeed he says, "This is my body and this is my blood." And that is received not in some Aristotelian category, as the Romans would have it, but rather it is indeed administered by faith with thanksgiving through the Holy Spirit. Right? And Christ is present there, and again, that's the consistent position of the early church and of the as well as coming out of the Reformation. There is the personal element of it. It's not just merely an abstract idea. Baptism is not just simply an individual professing a set of ideals that they now hold to. It's actually the swearing of an oath and of a spiritual action that takes place in and around those means. And likewise with communion. It is the grace of God being administered to us, the personal element. So when we abandon the gospel, when we distort it, when we water it down, when we do X, Y, or Z thing with it to ruin its purity and to ruin the truthfulness and veracity of it, it is actually a violation of the oath that we have to God, and it's a act of treason against not just a set of ideals in the abstract realm of the ether, as it were, but it's actually treason against God, a person, right? That deeply personal element is something that's really, really important for us to understand, especially when you see it with such kind of verbiage of us having been deserting him who called you by the grace of God, right? There's an action inherent in that notion of calling, right? So it's entirely personalized. It's essentially Paul being bewildered as to how you so quickly, right? Because this is being written not all that long after he is actually visited there in Acts chapters 13 and 14, as we looked at in our previous Bible study. He's writing this a year and a half, 2 years later-ish, roughly speaking. And so quickly they have been infiltrated. So quickly they're now in droves starting to desert him who called you, right? You would betray Jesus after he's already done all these things for you, and you do it so quickly, right? That's where the sarcasm and the bewilderment comes in this kind of sentence. And of course he finishes the verse identifying what they're abandoning Christ for, and it is for a different gospel, which is really not another gospel, is what he then begins the next verse by saying, right? Which is not.
I think he's generous with the word gospel.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So let's unpack what he means by this. Deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. The best part, some translations might have the word another twice there, so saying another gospel, which is not really another. The most direct English translation of this would be that first word being different, okay? So for a different gospel, and that's just not a matter of semantics, there's an important reason for that. And it's tied to what then comes through the rest of verse 7. So let me read that and then we can backtrack, okay? For a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ, okay? So this usage of the word distort, again, a couple of different ways you could use that, but distort's really, again, the most operative word there. Helps us understand what he means by different gospel, okay? So, in order to do this, we need to do a little bit of metaphysics.
One of my versions says would pervert the gospel.
Pervert can be used as well, that's fine. It captures the same meaning as, to distort or to pervert. In this context can be synonymous, absolutely, that's fine. So, a bit of philosophy, biblical philosophy, which is important for you to see. Truth is obviously a fundamental aspect of the world the world that God has made. Truth is fundamental to who God is. God himself, of course, is over and over again called truth. He himself is not just merely referred to as being truthful, but actually as being truth. He is the truth, right? Of course, Christ most famously says this in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The word of God is referred to as being the truth, which is also first and foremost a reference to Christ, who is the word of God, and then the word of God, which is what you all have sitting in front of you. To call this the word of God is to call it the word of Christ, because every word spoken in here is ultimately from Christ himself, who is the word of God, from beginning to end. So truth being fundamental is fairly obvious to us. However, how we understand truth to operate will then actually impact how we understand its inverse or its converse, namely lies or falsehood, to operate as well. Truth is an abstract reality. Okay, that is to say, it is independent of us. Right, the great failing of our modern time, especially under the prevailing philosophy of postmodernism, is that truth is actually unidentifiable. The Western world went from, in pre-modern times, a Christian biblical philosophical understanding of truth. Truth is objective. Truth is abstract. In other words, it's not just merely a matter of subjective opinion. It's actually apart from our human mind, not from any mind together, but it's actually part of and is in God's mind and independent of ours, right? So every single one of us as human beings could be gone like that, and 2 + 2 would still equal 4. Okay, abstract, and again, mathematicians are very well familiar with this concept. It then transitioned into a period in which truth became subjective. So in other words, truth was something that was filtered through the human mind. This is, of course, the great debates that existed between the empiricists and the rationalists of the Enlightenment period, prevailing through the 18th, 19th, and kind of most of the 20th century as well. All the way through until really the last 50 or so years, where then, having so far abandoned truth, many of the philosophers transitioned into what we now call that postmodern period, which is that truth actually really isn't identifiable at all. And so this is where we get the prevailing phase of you have your truth and I have my truth, which is really no truth at all.
Yeah. Just another nice way of saying we both have different opinions.
Yeah, correct. And so we have a horribly distorted, to use the word here, understanding of truth. All of this I'm saying to lay the groundwork for this particular concept. The opposite of truth being lies, and for those who have been in our sermons for a while, who have been with us on Sundays for a while, you will have heard me explain this concept before in other settings. The relationship, the ontological relationship or the philosophical relationship between truth and lies, falsehood, error, I'm kind of using those terms synonymously. For this case, I'll use falsehood, right? So truth and falsehood. The relationship between truth and falsehood is inversely related. Okay, so that is to say, I'll use another example that I've commonly used, which is that of light and darkness. Okay, something which would be even more obviously and familiar to us. Darkness is not itself an active substance that has property like light does. Darkness is the absence of light. Okay, there's no dark photons, you wouldn't even call them photons, but dark particles kind of bouncing around the room right now to balance out the photons or the light particles. There's just light particles and then the absence of those light particles in various ways. And as you look around the room, you see some more lit, of course, we're near windows and under lights, other areas that are more shaded where the light's not on or the windows closed, blinds are closed. It's an inverse relationship. When we walk in here, there was no need for me to first turn off the dark switches and then turn on the light switches, right? Okay.
I so want to put that on the wall.
Sure, yes. Just to confuse people. So inverse correlation, right? An inverse relationship. The more light, the less dark at an exact proportionate ratio. So proportionally, inversely related, right? Simple concepts, but have more complex ways of phrasing it. Order and chaos are exactly in the same relationship. So just as dark is the absence of light, chaos is the absence of order. Okay, and as well as between good and evil. Okay, evil is but the absence of good. It's not an actual active force. That's an entirely Oriental Eastern concept. Okay, particularly in more common forms of yin and yang. Right?
So there's another saying that, when good men do nothing, evil thrives.
Right, yes, because of the absence, yes, and that's why that phrase exists in the West and not elsewhere. Yeah, okay. Exactly. And so there is no scenario in which, even through his not only foreknowledge but actually ordination of the fall, there is no realm in which God is the author of evil in that philosophical sense. Okay. The absence of human good, apart from the obvious fact that it's the human responsibility, it's not an active force. There's no instance from a philosophical perspective in which everything's going fine and then the fall happens and then God creates this brand new thing in the universe called evil. That's not how that works, and that's never how that's worked. They're inversely related in the same sense. It's an absence of its opposite, namely good. Okay? Truth and falsehood, exactly the same. falsehood is but the absence of truth. Now, it's achieved by one of two ways. No matter how complex things get, it can ultimately be boiled down to two different mechanisms or avenues. One is more childish and usually only found through children or unfathomably stupid adults. The other one is really the more common way. So the more childish one, I'll start on that one. Falsehood through invention. Falsehood through invention. So this is the scenario where the parent comes home, or they walk into the room, say for example, and they see a whole bunch of mess in the kitchen. They see the cake that was sitting on the bench half eaten and fallen on the ground, and there's tomato sauce splayed on the wall, and then you see little Timmy with all the icing of the cake around his face and tomato sauce in his hands and everything else, and the dirt and everything else. And Mum asks little Timmy, did you do this, or what happened? And he says, oh, no, it wasn't me. I was outside and playing in the dirt, and I was outside kicking a soccer ball, just completely inventing a lie. And, oh, this must have been my brother who's off playing sport and actually isn't home at all, and the little boy forgets that because he's caught up in his little lie, and just the most ridiculous childish lie that you could come up with, right?
A lot of criminals come up with that sort of thing.
Yeah, like I said, there are plenty of unfathomably stupid adults as well. I have many friends who are police and the frequent flyers who come through those stations, who the kind who the news will report as being known to the police. Can come up with the most fanciful tales you would ever hear.
That's why they keep asking over and over, because the fabrication changes because you can't remember.
You can't keep it all together, yeah, correct. And so that's falsehood by invention. It's the complete fabrication of an entirely untrue story about X, Y, Z, which is usually, like I said, usually contained to the realm of children and the laziest and dumbest of criminals, as well as all those who are so narcissistically manipulative that they genuinely think they can actually get away with it. So like I said, however, the other 95% of the time, falsehood comes by that second mechanism or means, and that is falsehood by distortion. Okay? So we talked about falsehood by invention. This is now falsehood by distortion. Falsehood by distortion is essentially, as the name suggests, it is the taking of that which is true and to one degree or another, very operative phrase, one degree or another, distorting it so that it is now no longer the pure essence of truth that it once was about whatever you happen to be talking about, but it is now a distorted, i.e. corrupted version thereof, okay? The reason why I say to one degree or another, this kind of scale or spectrum-like reference is extremely important. It may be an overwhelming distortion, so it may be distorted 90% with like a kernel of truth, and then the rest is just part of that invention aspect. But there is still a kernel of truth, like the story is said in the right place at the right time of day or something, but then everything else is a fabrication, right? So it's a distortion of the truth. In this case, it's a massive one. It might be, again, we're using just numbers for the sake of understanding, it might be 50-50. It might be what typically gets called a half-truth in that parlance, right? It's got multiple points of truth, but then multiple points of okay? Which again, even in themselves on those points, individually are on a scale of distortion. So it might be this person said X, Y, Z, but then you distort a word that was said, or you distort how it was said. So the person did really say something, but then the wording gets changed, or the action gets changed, or whatever it happens to be, right? So even there's a kind of fractal nature to it, right? It can be divided down into its individual parts, right? Even if on the other end of this spectrum, it's 99% true, with just one little detail that's off concerning whatever, it's a falsehood by distortion. Okay? Every single part of that metaphysic of truth, right? That philosophical understanding of truth is one of the single most important things you can ever learn in life, because the sheer volume of things which that concept impacts is virtually incalculable. Okay, something that is 99% true is 100% false. Okay, something that is 99% true is 100% false, because unlike how we as humans tend to operate in our own sinfulness, there is no partiality in the being of God. He is not part loving and part just, for example, right? He doesn't switch, he doesn't turn his own characteristics on and off like a light switch when he's being loving and kind versus when he is administering his wrath in justice against evil. Okay? He is entirely himself at all times, in all ways, in all possibilities. None of it can be distorted, none of it can be minimized, none of it can be veiled or shadowed in the sense of its true essence. And truth is very much, of course, equally in that same category, that same vein. For something to be only 99% true means that it is entirely false. Okay? Because the reality of truth, like with other things in life, but the reality with truth is that it either entirely is or entirely is not. There's no middle ground, there's no vagaries, there's no kind of grey zone, no man's land as we might think of it. It is either true or it is false.
So
right?
water is either pure or it's not pure.
Exactly correct, thank you. Yes, 100%. Those who have any familiarity with poisons, particularly animal-type poisons, so rat poisons, for example, in terms of just sheer volume of the material in a rat poison, it's fractions of a percent that are actually poisonous in the overall mass of that rat poison that you would buy and put in homes. It's 0.00 whatever percent poison. It takes a tiny little amount. So from a mathematical perspective, that rat poison is 99.999 whatever percent totally fine, not poison, it's just food.
Innocuous, right? Yep.
Yeah, it's totally innocuous. Except for that little inkling of poison. And that's enough to kill the rat, right?
They gauge poisons by how many humans
Yeah, correct.
gram can kill.
Yeah, correct. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The most deadly substances in the world are measured in the smallest of volumetric measurements, and that's a good analogy, which is all it is. It's an analogy, but it's a good analogy to the way to the philosophy of truth. Okay, is that it is either entirely true or it's entirely false. And we can use all kinds of placated, and we can use all kinds of euphemisms. We can use all kinds of turns of phrase and of sophistry, quite frankly, to either minimize that or to pretend it doesn't matter or to kind of water things down. But at the end of the day, that doesn't change the metaphysical reality of truth. Distortion is how the absolute preponderance of lies are ever promulgated and even created and promulgated. It's a distortion of truth, and the best liars are able to maximize the amount of truth while very finely counterbalancing it with enough lies to achieve their purpose, right? Enough lack of truth.
There's an example of not just how it's just a single distortion, but it's a distortion upon a distortion upon a distortion. So there was a picture in a town of this African American picking up some roadkill, which happened to be a goose that was run over.
Sure.
And then that got distorted to the immigrants stealing the local geese to eat in And then that got distorted again to the Haitians are now stealing all the pets, cats and dogs. To
Oh,
eat.
the state's talking about. Sure. Yeah.
That's distortion after distortion. And it just
There are multiple. Yeah, and this and
picture of just picking up some road guy and putting it in the bin. That's all.
right. I mean, these things can happen in all kinds of ways. Yeah, and so multiple. That's what's kind of there's multiple layers. There's always multiple layers to how these things unfold, because then the constituent elements of the whole lie, ultimately, what is ultimately a lie. Those constituent elements can have varying degrees of lie. As I was indicating earlier, there can be different ratios of distortions about that, right? And so you can see how complex this can actually become, right? And there's a reason for this, by the way. There's a reason why there is great complexity to this whole notion of the relationship between truth and lies from a metaphysical perspective. Metaphysics, in other words, the nature of how these things are, their being, right? This goes because it is one of the single most ancient things in our world. Of course, the entire fall occurs because of this very dynamic and dance between truth and the absence of truth in the fall. It comes by virtue of the serpent, Satan, distorting the word of God to Adam and Eve by asking her a knowingly duplicitous question that was 99% true, except for the one lie. And in this case, the more sneaky, duplicitous kind, which is the lie by omission. Okay. He asks her, if my memory serves me correctly in the wording, did God really say that you cannot eat of any of these trees? Right? Well, no, God didn't say we can't eat of any of the trees. He said we can't eat from the one. There's one tree. We can eat from any of the other trees.
She answered truthfully.
For the one. Yeah. And it's the distortion, it's the omission in that craftily worded question that then engages that spiral of downfall which then occurs first in Eve and then in Adam ultimately. In this case, it's not even the inclusion of an untrue fact, which is not a fact at all, of course, hence why he says a different gospel, which is not really another gospel. Again, we're going to come back to that once we've done through this notion of distortion. It was the omission of something, okay, which is even more tricky because it's something that's hidden, literally. You're omitting something, right? It's not including it. So everything that's been said thus far might sound true, except for the omission of something, which would actually end up casting the rest of that truth in its full picture, right? So it's designed to manipulate and to distort. That's the name. But this is how truth works, and conversely, falsehood. Again, invented falsehood happens, but it's it's blindingly obvious. Again, shockingly few people in history have ever converted from Christianity to Islam. Just in terms of volume, let alone in terms of ratio. The ratio between converts from Christianity to Islam versus Islam to Christianity might as well be infinity. It's such a wide disparity. It's not even, not even remotely close. Especially not today. 5 people and a stray dog convert out of Christianity into Islam these days, whereas millions of Muslims convert to Christianity at this rate every year. The ratio is not even close.
People convert to Islam by having the threat of their head being cut off.
Yeah, that's usually how it occurred, especially in the medieval period. Yeah, correct. It was usually a conversion at the end of a sword. Is by and large how those conversions happened. But the ratios aren't even close. And the reason why that's the case is because as someone is sitting in church or as someone is sitting in Christianity, it's so prima facie obvious that Islam is untrue, even by the most cursory understanding of what it teaches, let alone a deeper examination, which only multiplies that by orders of magnitude. And that likewise goes for other things. Again, there's an overt way in which it's so obviously incorrect. We do the same thing with, again, it's the same relationship to Mormonism, to the Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., etc., etc. What has always been the much more duplicitous and effective, not ultimately effective, praise be to God, but effective in its own ways at different times, are distortions of teachings not from outside the church, but inside the church. Okay, the greatest threats to Christianity have always arisen from within it, not from without.
The wolf in sheep's clothing.
Hence that analogy, exactly. That's exactly why that image is given. All the major heresiarchs, right? So the arch heretics of the church were all ministers in churches. It was Arius, right, and Arianism. It was Nestorius and Nestorianism. It was Pelagianism, etc., etc., etc. All these guys in the early church who were springing out left, right, and centre all over the empire were clergy. They were theologians in the church.
Which is doubly egregious because...
Correct.
Yeah, so basically they had the knowledge of the gospel.
They have the knowledge and they have the experience and they have the skill to be able to teach.
Yeah.
Which is why they become, and why men in my position become prime targets for that kind of corruption and distortion.
Okay.
Because on top of all that, or actually really I suppose underneath all that, undergirding all that, is authority. Right? There is a meaningful and rightful authority among the clergy, obviously administered in service and with humility and integrity and everything else. That's assumed, but there is a rightful authority. There is the scriptures are abundantly clear that all things being equal, when the ministers of God's church, Old or New Testament, are operating faithfully and with integrity, they should be listened to. Okay, because there has to be order, there has to be hierarchy.
But can they be challenged if people feel they're not?
They can be challenged, but it has to be challenged on the basis of something higher than just the individual, which is of course this.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's a meaningful challenge and a reasonable challenge. So not just wild-eyed, right? But a reasonable challenge to that authority is absolutely and 100% should be there, because the clergy, the ministers of the church, myself, are ultimately accountable not to myself or ourselves, but to God through His Word, right? So no, there absolutely is proving that and should be that. We'd be better off if there at times was more of that in the right context. But again, there's the right ways to go about that, like with anything else. But that's why, because there's when that kind of distortion happens among the ministers, like the ones that I mentioned earlier, from some of those more obvious early church settings, they've got the knowledge, they've got more knowledge comparatively than their congregants, which is not a negative, right? Because you like to think that the person preaching and teaching week out knows more. Otherwise, what are we doing here? We're kind of wasting time.
You get a plumber to do your pipes, electrician to do your wiring.
Yeah, correct. I like to think that hopefully my plumber knows more about the plumbing, because otherwise, why am I hiring the plumber to do it?
So you get a clergyman to help organise the theology.
Correct. It's no different. It's like anything else. It makes total sense. Every one of us has been given different gifts, and that's good. And so then they have the knowledge, they have the experience, especially in the ancient world. Bit less today, but it's still there today, where those who are trained in rhetoric, formally trained in rhetoric. I wish more ministers had that training in rhetoric. I've been fortunate enough to. So they know how to make convincing arguments. They know what is a convincing argument, what's not. They know how to use pathos, in other words, to move the emotions of the audience that they're listening to them, and that can be a totally fine thing if it's done in a good way for good reasons.
Billy Graham was really good at that.
Exactly, all kinds of people. But and there are good ways of doing it for good reasons, right? Otherwise, it's just stale and boring. But that can also be manipulated, and it's actually very easy to manipulate. So most, and again, nothing wrong with this either, but most congregants are not aware of how much effort their own pastor goes into to not inappropriately sway them emotionally. In fact, most of my time is spent carefully wording what I do and don't say in order to avoid that consequence.
Okay.
Right? And that's just good practice among any minister. It's not just me. That would be good. That's good practice among any minister, because there are good ways of doing that, and then there are ways that are powerful but that are not with integrity, and the authority, like I mentioned, right? So all these things are just layers and layers and layers building up to how truth can be distorted in ways that can just spread themselves like wildfire and bring untold millions under its sway in all kinds of different ways. So a distortion, right? Are you understanding, at least in the foundational sense, this distinction between invented falsehood and distorted falsehood? Yep, cool. That alone will make someone, when they understand that distinction and understand all the kinds of ways in which that it's not just, oh, I'm going to be told an absolute bold-faced blatant lie. You may well be, but in all likelihood it's not going to be that. That's the invented falsehood. It's more likely than not, 9 times out of 10, going to be a distorted falsehood. So
Sometimes I tell people, if you actually want to find what the lie is, find the kernel of truth it's based on.
Yeah, correct.
And you'll see the distortion.
Yeah, correct. Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. You have to, in order to know whether a line is crooked, you first have to know what a straight line looks like. Understanding that is how you then start to be able to safeguard oneself against falsehoods to the greatest degree. All of this obviously is entirely wrapped in wisdom, because at the end of the day, you're having to make judgment calls on certain information, whether this is true, whether that's true, how is it true or not, what's the context, like you're having to make a whole bunch of judgment calls, sometimes even on the fly, right? So none of this operates outside the purview of wisdom, which we should all pray for growth in. And the more wisdom, the better, because really a lot of it comes down to discernment and wisdom, right? Discerning between truth and error particularly. But even as long as we understand that basic metaphysic of truth, that is the most foundational thing you can understand with regards to truth and lies, or i.e. truth and falsehoods, right? Inverse correlated relationship, right? Falsehood is the absence of truth and always is, okay? From that, there are invented falsehoods and there are distorted falsehoods, and distorted falsehoods are just in one sense, distortion, a perversion of that which is true. And so it's X% true, X% untrue. It's entirely false, and that's how that works. There's no, it's a half truth and that's just okay. And no, if it's 99% true, it's 100% false. Okay? So in this context, now that we've touched on this distorting the gospel, they're not coming up with an absolutely brand new gospel and they're talking about some guy named Bob over in Babylon and he did this thing. And no. Everything that the heretics in Galatia are teaching, they're talking about Jesus of Nazareth, they're talking about the Gospels, they're talking about the apostles, or the then disciples, now apostles, they're talking about the crucifixion. No, they're talking about things, not just talking about some random, completely different person in a completely different place at a completely different time. That would be an invented falsehood, right? And no one in Galatia would fall for that, right? If these guys came along and started saying, well, actually the real Messiah lived 500 years ago over in this place and did this and did that, completely irrelevant to that would be so obvious. And again, would fool no one. That's why I was pointing to Islam. That's why Islam is so evidently false on the surface level, because essentially things are rolling just fine through Christianity for 600 years. And then a guy who's never been a Christian comes along 600 years later and says, oh, well, actually, all these guys in the New Testament, especially Paul, were all lying, and really, here's what actually happened about these events 600 years ago, which you had no connection to and have never had a connection to ever, right? And you don't know what happened because you can't read the Gospels and you don't know the basic tenets of Christianity. You think the Trinity is made up of Jesus, Mary, and Allah, which no one's ever believed. Like, it's just a whole host of very obvious things.
Well, you think we're not worshipping one God, we're worshipping three.
We're worshipping three gods, which again, yeah. So that's exactly. Oh, the Quran explicitly says that. Yeah, as far as the Quran is concerned, the Quran. Yeah, yes, in the Quran, Muhammad is under two gigantically obvious misunderstandings. One is that Christians are worshipping three gods. Not that his claim is not that. Oh, Christians think they're worshipping one God, but really they're worshipping three. Because you could try and make that argument as a polemic against Christianity. He's just straight up under the impression that we're tritheists. In other words, we worship three different gods.
Total ignorance.
Total ignorance. And more importantly, that Trinity, or those three gods, are made up of Isa, which for simplicity's sake I'll call Jesus. It's a bit more complex than that, but let's just go with Jesus. Allah and Mary. So he's genuinely under the impression that Christians are, that's the Trinity. He has no concept of the Holy Spirit, nothing. So it's completely, so prima facie, obviously false. Which is why Christians, again, by and large, don't fall for it. If Christians have ever converted into Islam, it's usually for one of two reasons. It's because they did so at the end of the sword, or because they were kidnapped as children, like the Janissaries during the Ottoman Empire. That's it. Where the Ottomans would roll into Greece and the Balkans and kidnap 1,000 children as essentially tributary hostages and raise them as Ottomans in the imperial court and transform them into Ottomans to then send them back to the country they were stolen from to fight and conquer their own people.
Do they think that Mary is the mother of Christ?
Well, yeah, they think she's, they think she's the mother, but then again, they have those elements for sure. But there is a section of the Quran that is very clearly under the impression that Christians are worshipping her in the Trinity, and like there's no matter what one's opinion of veneration of the saints or asking for intercessory prayer on the part of the saints in Roman Catholicism is, or even in Eastern Orthodoxy to a lesser degree, no one in the history of Christianity has ever considered Mary a part of the Trinity ever. Like there's literally not one human being. The first time this idea ever even popped up was when Muhammad wrote it in the Quran.
But they think Jesus is just a prophet as well.
Yes, I mean, essentially the next greatest prophet after Muhammad.
Yes.
And there's a whole host of other things. Yeah, he didn't really die on the cross. Instead, Allah actually, it was Judas that was crucified on the cross, but then Allah tricked everyone and made them think it was Jesus, and Jesus instead actually didn't die and then ascended to heaven. Again, it's just wildly, so patently retarded ideas.
And to think that so that we are not worshipping Allah, but we're also worshipping Jesus, who was only a prophet,
And Mary.
Which
no one's ever done.
Which to them is insulting. There's only one God.
Yeah, it's shirk. Yeah, correct. And so that's my whole point about invented truths. They're just extremely obvious that they're invented truths. Invented falsehoods. Sorry, the invented falsehoods. They're just so obviously wrong that they're extremely difficult to fall for, and almost no one ever does. That's the distorted falsehoods that are the vast majority of falsehoods, and can be so powerful that, entire false religions can be started under that vein or under that guise. And so, on that wording and that understanding, which is of distortion, understanding that metaphysical distinction, here's how you then understand what he means by a different gospel. Okay. None of what you're going to see throughout this book will be, like I was kind of tongue-in-cheek referring to earlier, will be portraying the idea that the heretics here in Galatia were coming along and saying, no, the Messiah wasn't Jesus of Nazareth. It was some other completely random guy at a different time who did utterly different things. That's not what's going on here. In fact, if you sat down the Judaizers and the Christians who have maintained their faithfulness to the gospel, and therefore to Christ, more importantly, if you sat them down and just did a kind of tally of their total beliefs about Christianity, the preponderance would be exactly the same. Okay? The vast majority. In fact, the high majority would be exactly the same. Every one of them believe that Jesus was God in the flesh. Every one of them, in terms of if you ask them the question is what I mean, right? Every one of them would say that Jesus came in the flesh. Every single one of them would say that he was born in Bethlehem. Every single one of them would say that he was raised and lived up in Nazareth in Galilee. Every single one of them would say that he was usually translated carpenter. It's a bit more complex than that, but anyway, a tekton in the Greek word. Every one of them would say that he was the son of Mary and Joseph. Every single one of them would explain that he walked on the water and he did this, he fed the 5,000, he turned water into wine at the wedding of Cana, blah, 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 blah. Every single one of them would say that he was put on trial before Pontius Pilate and the Jews. Every single one of them would say that he died on the cross. Every single one of them would say that he was buried, and every single one of them would say that he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. right? So then you go, well, where's the distortion in the gospel? Because after all those big key factors, which is kind of just a gross oversimplification of the story itself, right? Well, the distortion comes, as we're going to see, it's not here, but as we're going to see, the distortion comes in the view and interpretation of those facts. And more importantly, a distortion of how that relates, in this specific case of Galatians, how that relates to the Old Covenant, okay? And the Mosaic Code particularly, okay? That's where this comes in. It's an extremely duplicitous distortion, as this book will then unfold for us, and as we will obviously connect dots and explain things in between. It's really not terribly surprising at all that Galatia got swept up in this, because really, whether this landed in Galatia or whether this landed in Ephesus or whether this landed in Philippi or just about anywhere else, I would almost guarantee that everyone else would have got caught up in it anyway. There's not, they've been Christian for 5 minutes, comparatively speaking, and they're being infiltrated by a very, very craftily, carefully crafted lie. Okay, and so this different gospel, which is not really another, in other words, another gospel. Okay, because there is no multiple gospels. There is no multiple good news, right? The good news, that's fine. The good news of the incarnation and of God of God coming among His people, and of God dying for us and sacrificing Himself to redeem us from death and hell and sin, and rising from the dead and ascending into heaven and being enthroned over the universe, etc., etc., etc. All of that good news. There is no other good news. There is nothing else that is good news to mankind who is entrapped and ensnared in the curse of sin. Okay, so there's not this gospel and another gospel, right? In reality, it's a different gospel, which is really not another gospel at all, is what he's saying. There is no other good news. There's only this good news. It's not, again, it's kind of like that point about truth. There's no, here's the truth, and then here's the thing that's kind of true. No, here's the truth, and here's the lie, is what that really is. If something is 99% true, it's 100% false. That's, as I was saying earlier, okay? There is that which is truth, and then there is that which is not truth. There is no middle ground. You are with me, or you are against me. There's not those who are you're half for Jesus and half for someone else. There's no one who can rightfully say, oh well, I'm partly loyal to Christ, but partly disloyal. No, you're just disloyal. You're just disloyal. And again, this is obvious based if you just compare it analogously to other things in life. There's no, I'm faithful to my spouse, to my husband or my wife. I'm faithful to my wife part of the time. No, you're actually unfaithful, because you're entirely faithful or you're entirely unfaithful, and vice versa, the wife to her husband. I'm mostly faithful. I'm faithful on these days of the week, and then I'm not as faithful on these days of the week. No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. That's not how that works. And the same, because that's the essence of truth, right? And so there is no gospel and then the other gospel, which is half true. It's half good news and half not good news. Well, there's no good news at all, is it? Because it's either entirely good news or it's not. And so, yep.
But I mean, as we get on in life and we see that, I mean, as teenagers, everything's black and white. Everything's black and white. It's either this or it's this. But there are some things, yes, what you're saying, that is just black and white. There's truth or untruth. Yep. But then you see other things in life that you used to think was black and white, and you see it's nuanced. There are degrees. There can be
that for sure. I mean, there still exists within life the realm of opinion. So there definitely are matters of opinion. So if I can give another kind of simplistic trite analogy, between chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla ice cream. One may have a favourite of chocolate, another person may have a favourite of vanilla, and another person may have a favourite of strawberry. Okay, It's entirely subjective. I mean, the reality is that, again, if you just in this example, if you assume for quality control, all three flavors actually taste good. They don't taste bad in that sense, right? So like one of them is not spoiled. In other words, they're all totally fine, right? From a nutritional or a food safety perspective, all of them taste fine. Whether person A likes chocolate or vanilla or strawberry will be a matter of subjective opinion, and that's totally fine. What's not a matter of subjective opinion, and what is actually not, hence then subject to opinion, is whether the pink ice cream is strawberry or chocolate or vanilla.
Yeah.
It's strawberry, and there's no debate over whether it's strawberry. Someone can't come along and say, in my opinion, the pink ice cream is chocolate. No, it's not. It's strawberry. And you don't get an opinion on that. Opinions are totally fine, right? Because people have opinions about all kinds of things. But the true essence of opinion, again, because of I mentioned this earlier as well, way back, because of the influence of postmodernism and the hyper-subjective time in which we live, the scope of the domain of opinion has been grossly hyperinflated, not just overinflated, hyperinflated. So the room, the kind of, so when I say scope, I do mean like in that scale sense, and how big that domain is. The scale of the domain of opinion has been so hyperinflated that all kinds of things can, in our modern Western parlance, be rendered an opinion, when in reality, you're actually just wrong.
Yeah, if you say, oh, look, the sky is blue, someone else says, well, that's your opinion.
Yeah, the grass is green and that, that's just your opinion. Yeah, correct. And so exactly, and especially when someone's doubling down and tripling down on a postmodern metaphysic of truth, which just very quickly reaches the terminus of a terminal point of insanity. And so what's happened is because of that hyperinflation of the domain of opinion, of subjective opinions, which there is a domain for, like I said, if I keep on that little trite ice cream analogy, it's totally fine for someone to have a preference for vanilla or a preference for strawberry or a preference for chocolate, okay? You can't say the pink one is chocolate or vanilla because it's not. That's no longer an opinion, right? However, in reality, what's occurring there, and this is usually what the opinion of domains actually is, like I'm saying, we've hyperinflated this beyond description. The reality is that in the operation of the world in which you live, whether your preference is strawberry, or your preference is vanilla, or your preference is chocolate ice cream, doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. It's actually not functionally consequential to anything at all, other than obviously like you purchasing ice cream. But I mean, like in terms of life and the sun rising and setting in the morning and the evening, and life continuing to operate and go on, your opinion about which is your favorite flavor of ice cream doesn't matter at all. And so that is really largely, especially from a historical perspective, that is where opinion, that's the rightful balance of the domain of opinion. It just, same as here, what colour the walls are. There would be ones that would look better based on the carpet colour, for example, so complementarily. So there is some fact to that, obviously. But within us, as we were going through when we were redoing the carpet a couple of years ago, we had a scope where we said, obviously, we need to keep it in this limit because that's what'll work aesthetically, and then just choose one because it really doesn't matter beyond that point because they all work and it's just subjective opinion. And so, obviously, as humans, we have a prolific and fine-tuned ability to overinflate the significance of our own opinions. But the healthy domain of opinion is far, far, far smaller than what we're used to operating with in our modern time. Even on theological issues. On theological issues, there obviously can be a balance, especially within congregations or between churches or denominations, whatever it is to be in denominations, etc., where having reasonable, healthy discussions, emphasis on the words reasonable and healthy, are useful, and always generally useful, if they're reasonable and healthy, among Christians who are operating in good faith and within reasonable bounds and conduct on subjects that they have two different interpretations over what X, Y, or Z means in the scripture, for example. Like the gospel, which is the whole... I'm not just saying this abstractly or irrelevantly. I'm saying this because it's exactly the context of this whole section here. However, two different Christians can have a good faith discussion. So when I say good faith, they're both operating from a place of friendship, not enmity. They're both operating with integrity. So they're trying to represent... They're not purposefully distorting what the other person believes and vice versa. They're actually steel manning, in other words, presenting their best possible case of what the other person believes. They're being logically consistent and constantly checking whether or not their thinking is incorrect or any kind of fallacies. That's a good faith discussion, and it's a skill that's
they're more open to listening to what the other person
actually
says.
listening. Yes, correct.
Than actually trying to expound their own opinion.
Thinking about whether or not they're actually incorrect at all, let alone largely whatever happens to be. So what goes into a good faith discussion is actually there are multiple layers to that, and good faith discussions have all but abandoned us in these days.
Usually I say, you were just asking me that question so you can have an argument, aren't you?
Right, yeah, there's all kinds of things like that. Sure. No, 100%. That can occur. However, in that dynamic, in reality, from a biblical perspective, because we're keeping on that biblical example, someone is actually right and someone's wrong, or they're both wrong. Right, so it could actually be a discussion between two guys who are actually both wrong on the subject, right? That's also possible, right? But by and large, they can't both be right, otherwise they'll be making the same arguments, right?
Sometimes they are making the same argument, but just saying it in a different way.
Exactly, and hopefully the discussion will filter out where they realise they're actually making the same point. Yeah. So that's only once you've moved to that point, right?
Yeah.
But so the dynamic, if they're actually having genuine, like what are in reality opposing arguments, either one's right and the other's wrong, or they're both wrong. Okay, you can still treat each other in good faith and et cetera, but you can't just pretend. You also can't, on the counterbalance of that, abandon the reality of truth, right? If someone you can't just pretend that it's totally fine to just, oh, well, you have your opinion about what this says or doesn't say, and I have my opinion about what... No, someone is right or someone is wrong, right? Or you're both wrong, but you get my picture.
The other one, let's just agree to disagree, and I go...
Yeah, but that's kind of agreeing to disagree. But what are you saying? All you're doing in that essence is saying, oh, this doesn't matter. Now there is a balance to this, right? The worst, and so again, it's why we've got to be careful. We've got to be very careful with how we talk to people, because the reality is that the sincerity of what one believes, and this is where this really ties into our subject here. Every single one of the Judaizers in this Galatian context would look anyone else dead straight in the face with absolute sincerity, by and large. I mean, there no doubt would have been some manipulators, but by and large, the majority of them, without having ever met them, I could just rightfully assume a priori that every one of them very sincerely believed what they were saying. Do you know what I mean? Certainly the majority of them. Right, other than like probably a core group of knowingly duplicitous, the majority would hear, and really any of the Judaizers believe. And we know, and the reason why I'm not just saying that to be like overly, to kind of try and be super fair to them. That's how heresies have always operated. Arius and Arianism, which is one of the single biggest heresies in the history of the church, other than Judaizing and Gnosticism, Arius as a presbyter, right, an elder, a minister in the Church of Alexandria, well educated, went to seminary at the School of Alexandria, well spoken, etc., absolutely sincerely believed what he believed. Problem is, he was dead wrong, and his misinterpretation. We know this because we've been going through all this in church history, as we weaved our way through the 4th century, particularly. The Council of Nicaea in 325, and the life of Athanasius of Alexandria, leading all the way up to the Council of Constantinople in 381. The entire Arian heresy boiled down to a battle over the meaning of the word monogenes, right? Only begotten or only unique, right? Everything else in the life of Jesus Christ was entirely understood and believed. Every single one of them believed all those things I mentioned earlier: the incarnation, the virgin birth, the life in Nazareth, the miracles, the trial, the crucifixion, the death, burial, resurrection, blah, 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 the ascension. Every one of them believed that. Except Arius and his people, his followers, who had a different interpretation of what the word monogenes, or only begotten, like as in like the only begotten son, right, meant. And in that simple distortion, not an invented truth, a distortion of what that word meant, launched a heresy that plagued the church for 300 years.
They interpreted that Christ was created by God.
Correct.
Instead of coexisting of God.
And was not eternal. The definitive point, the consequence of that interpretation, was that he was not eternal. Yeah. That he was the firstborn of all creation in a literal biological sense, not rather in a metaphysical sense of substance, which is what that term actually means, in reference to the resurrection. And that he, essentially, the Father creates Jesus, Jesus creates the world, or the Father creates the world through Jesus. You get the picture.
And Jesus is a lesser being.
That's the ultimate consequence. They wouldn't say that, they wouldn't phrase it that way, but that's the consequence of that belief. And Arianism has been revived in Mormonism, it's been revived in the Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So one word, I make that point in those church history lessons, which if you want to look at it more, the entire Arian heresy boils down to one word. One word, that's all it is. The distortion of one single word. If it's 99% true, it's 100% false. And Arianism almost takes over the entire church in the 4th century.
Really? It spread that far?
Well, that's what we cut. Yeah, exactly. And I explain this in our church history class in those lessons, which you'd be able to find on our website and YouTube and stuff. Yeah, you get to the point where the majority of people sitting in churches on any given Sunday, at least in the eastern provinces of the empire, are Arians.
This is a serious.
It's bad enough that, especially among the clergy, the ratio is so heavily tilted that Athanasius, who is the chief defender of the Orthodox biblical doctrine on Christ and the Trinity, those who supported Athanasius but who were feeling hopeless about it all, said of him that it's Athanasius against the world. And so then this famous phrase was coined, Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, because he has this famous speech where he says, if the world goes against the truth, then I go against the world. I stand against the world, same thing. And inscribed on his tomb was Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. Ultimately, his faithfulness and his teachings triumph and prevail, and orthodoxy is restored in the Council of Constantinople, blah, 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 blah. But the Arian heresy still prevailed for another 200 years after that. It just moved location and plagued the Goths in Western Europe, threatened to overtake Western Europe now at that point, before it was eventually saved by the Merovingians and others, the Franks. The distortion of one single word. So if you talk to Arius and to Athanasius and ask them every detail contained in the Gospels, they would agree on quite literally every single word in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, from beginning to end of those 4 Gospels. Every last word, and I mean literally every word, they would agree on between Athanasius and Arius, except for monogenes. And that turns the entire gospel upside down and distorts it and perverts it and corrupts it beyond repair. One word.
And what year would have these been? Was it like during the Apostles, or what year was this? Sort of like what century? Oh,
we're talking here. Oh, this is all 4th century stuff.
So long after.
Arius. You're long after.
Okay,
centuries after. But it's just the most obvious example. It's one of the most obvious and powerful examples in the history of the church, but in the early church particularly, where the whole war battled down. The whole war kind of could dwindle down to the interpretation of one single word, monogenes. Ultimately, every other obviously there's 1,000 different arguments, but every argument can be reduced back to the irreducible factor that is the interpretation of monogenes as a word. Yeah, monogenes. And that's the distortion. So that's 99.9999 repeated % truth, but it's not 100. So there you go. And it's a different gospel, because ultimately what ends up happening, and this is now the inverse now that I've said that, I explained that Athanasius and Arius could sit down, not that they did, I'm saying they could sit down in a room, hypothetically, and agree on every single word in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, except for the interpretation of monogenes. But the consequence of that is that every other word, retroactively now,
has a different meaning. It means something totally different.
Now it means something different.
And the gospel means different things.
Because ultimately, because of that distortion in the meaning on the part of Arius, the guy in your head that you call Jesus is not actually the real Jesus from the gospel stories.
Yeah.
So now it's actually an entirely non-existent being.
And it dilutes the grace, dilutes the justification of his death.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't just dilute; it actually eliminates, because that whole story now didn't happen, because there is no world in which God creates Jesus and Jesus creates the world, and then everything else follows on from there. That world doesn't exist. So now the consequence of distorting the meaning, i.e. changing the meaning of one single word, monogenes, now the entire story becomes pure fiction. Because that world, that reality, that story isn't real. It didn't happen. It doesn't exist, right? It would be, to use kind of a somewhat comparative analogy, I'm born on the 31st of March, 1995. Someone writes a biography of me, and including all kinds of details, where I was born, in Katoomba here, where I was born, where I was raised here, schools I went to, blah, 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 did this, did that, church, all the kinds of things in my life. But the whole biography begins with me being born on March 30th. That person doesn't exist. A Daniel Thomas, me, born in Katoomba at 12:35 in the morning on March 30th, didn't happen and doesn't exist. That person doesn't exist. So no matter how similar all the rest of the biography seems, emphasis on the word seem, it's a fabrication. It's a lie. It doesn't exist. That person wouldn't exist. Even if it sounds like me, even if it's described like me, even if it has the same name, that individual, that person, born on the exact same time even, but on the wrong day, didn't happen and doesn't exist. That's the consequence philosophically. So the Jesus of the Aryans does not exist. It's the same with the Muslims. The Jesus of Islam doesn't exist. The distortion of the real Jesus means it's a false Jesus by definition. Then that doesn't exist. It's a figment. Right? That's the consequence.
It's interesting that people are really keen to distort Jesus and the gospel, but the other beliefs, no,
well,
not going to touch it.
Well, because it doesn't need to. That's how lies work. It doesn't need to.
Yeah.
Once again, it's the a little leaven's the whole bread. That's the whole analogy. Leaven is used in two different ways in Scripture. Leaven is used on the one hand positively and one hand negatively. So in one sense, leaven represents sin. So leaven in the Bible can be symbolic of sin. Again, very obviously more common agricultural analogy as was common in the ancient world. So sin is used as symbolic of sin, right? Leaven is, but it's also at times used in a completely different way to describe growth and fruitfulness. right? The leaven raising the bread, and blah blah blah. So you got to be careful with how you're interpreting it, because it's two different meanings depending on the context.
And the sinful analogy of leaven is that you can't point it out and say it's sin. It's like it's through everything.
It's festers. Yeah, that's
right
why it's
through
used
the
like
whole
that.
line.
Yeah, correct. That's why it's used like that.
It's clever that way.
Correct. Yeah, if you poison someone's drink, depending on what type of poison it is, but by and large, vast majority of the time, if you poison someone's drink, the color remains the same, the texture remains the same. The person's not going to know. Again, there are some poisons that disrupt, that actually disrupt the balance of the liquid, and so you can actually see it shimmering and shaking a bit with a minor chemical reaction. But anyway, more complex poisons, you're not going to know until you drink it. That's why historically kings have had cupbearers, right? Because there's no meaning, obviously, prior to being able to chemically test it, there's no way to just look at that cup of wine and go, is this poison or not, without actually someone physically drinking it, right?
Like the poison in The Princess Bride that's been credited
Sure.
to Australians.
Sure, yeah. Poison, yeah, exactly. And so there's no way to visually, because it just becomes ingrained in it. It just mixes in. Literally, in the case of drink, it just mixes in, and there's no way. And so it's not until it's too late that you realise, and that's the story of the fall, right? All of that is why he then says it's a different gospel. It's so operative to this whole book, and it's so important that you understand why this is the case. That's why I'm belabouring this point so heavily. Because it'll impact how you then see everything else, just like that point I was just making. When the lie comes into being through the distortion of the truth, it corrupts the entire thing, hence why I said something that's 99% true is 100% false, because everything else is tainted by the lie. Right? It's a distortion of the gospel, which results in a different gospel, which is really not another gospel at all. Okay? Verse 8, but even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to the gospel that we have proclaimed to you, let him be accursed. We're going to come back to that last word as our fourth and final point after this one. But this third point that we have today, even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to the gospel that we have previously proclaimed to you, right? If we, so in other words, we in this context is the apostles he's speaking of, if we with our authority as those who are eyewitnesses to Jesus, even if we were to come along, or if even an angel from heaven, he's looking at you, Muhammad, were to come along and to tell you a different gospel than that which has previously been given to you, let him be accursed.
But a true angel should be incapable of even doing that.
Well, correct, and that's the point.
Yeah.
That is the basis, and exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's, again, that's the whole point of this. Like, it's prima facie wrong. Like it's prima facie. It's so obviously wrong on the surface. You don't need to do a grand inquisition. Yeah. You can, but you don't need to. Yeah. The essential message of Islam, in terms of what is revealed to Muhammad in the early 7th century AD, is that the true religion has been corrupted and perverted and gone off the rails, and now Allah has sent his angel Gabriel, the messenger angel, to restore it. Now, there's 1,000 different implications of that. The more obvious of this is the fact that apparently God is so incompetent that he would allow that to happen. And more importantly, it would have been his own causing, because after all, Islam teaches and the Quran teaches that Jesus was not actually crucified. Instead, Judas was crucified, but Allah tricked all the witnesses into making it look like it was Jesus. It was a mirage, essentially. It was a facade.
Yeah.
And that the person who was buried in the tomb was actually Judas, not Jesus, and Jesus actually ascended to heaven, which is, again, it's all Gnostic. It's going to get, all Islam is, when you actually understand Islam, you realize very quickly it's just simply the most successful Gnostic cult. That's all it ever is. Mm-hmm. So then,
but it's such an intricately woven sort of misleading, you know, like, oh yeah, this mystic group, sort of David Copperfield illusion that was given to them.
Correct. And more importantly, it then spawns the single biggest false religion in the history of the world, as far as Islam would be concerned. Right? Christianity is the biggest religion in the world, and it's the biggest religion in the world that the world's ever seen, for a reason. And it would have been, but it just does not compute in the average Muslim's head that was entirely caused by Allah, who tricked the people into thinking it was Jesus in the first place. So, but what the problem is there is that when you're considering that, you're looking for logical consistency, and you're not going to find it because the whole thing's a lie. That's the problem, and lies by definition can't remain consistent, because when you start compounding the lies, it reaches such terminal velocity that the human being behind the lie can't actually keep up with the lie.
That's why the police keep asking you over and over again.
Over and over again, yeah, correct. In proper, sophisticated interrogations, the way that you reveal whether someone is lying to the person being interrogated is you have them tell the story multiple times. Okay, tell it to me over and over and over again, and they may remember more details. That's possible, right? But the details that have already been given are not going to change, right? They're not going to. The story's not going to change from Wednesday morning to Wednesday afternoon that this such and such happened, right? They may not exactly remember specifically if it was 4:27 p.m. on they're not going to remember that, right? Because we just don't operate that way. But they will remember whether it's 9 a.m. toward 9 a.m. or toward 4 p.m. Right? So if stories start shifting like that, then that's a more obvious sign, because the lie is now
or more embellishment.
Shifting, more embellishment, especially additional layers that don't actually add to the story. Blah 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 blah. There's all kinds of ways of doing it, and again, it's plenty of family who have been police and worked in intelligence, so I have a reasonable amount of knowledge on that as just a Jewish civilian, of how those things work. If we are an angel from heaven, and again, he's almost speaking hyperbolically here, but it's kind of to make the point. If we, or even an angel from heaven should come, right, and give you a different message than that which has already been given, so in other words, contradicts what God's already said previously, it's wrong. Because God hasn't, it's not like God's going to change his mind at some point in the future and go, oh, well, actually now it's blah, no, it is what it is. Because God's not like a man that he changes his mind, as the Old Testament says. The truth is just the truth. It's just objective. There's not going to be some grand change where all of a sudden something's going to need to come along later to massively correct it. And again, even in the Reformation, it's not, again, the common accusation against the validity of the Reformation in the 16th century was, and really even still is to this day, the argument against it has always been that this was a breakaway from the historic teachings of the church. The problem is that not only then, but especially now with the rise and advent of the internet, is that is demonstrably untrue. You can demonstrate, because I can sit here on a computer and inside of a minute I can pull up a source from the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century, etc., 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 to demonstrate what was said by whom about what. You know what I mean? And when. And those various things. And again, it's much more complex than that. It's not just a matter of just randomly pulling a quote out of someplace random. But the reality of the Reformation was it was a comparison of what was being believed by the time you got to the 15th and 16th centuries, and comparing that to what the patristic sources, i.e. the early church fathers, were saying about those very same subjects. That's what was going on, primarily bolstered by the advent of then the printing press, which is simply the late medieval, early modern equivalent of the internet anyway.
The most, I wouldn't say distressing, but certainly alarming thing is that we have the most access to accurate information.
Comparatively, not even close.
Been.
Yeah, not even close.
And also the most access to most inaccurate information.
It goes both ways. Yeah, the internet's a tool like anything else.
And yet we have not been able to develop the levels of thinking to work through what they call critical thinking.
Yep.
To work through, well, is this making sense to
correct.
building upon?
Oh no, you're 100% correct. Yep, and that's a much deeper. You're 100,000% right. That's something I've spoken to regularly, but and it's part of a much deeper discussion about history and about culture and everything else. But the fundamental reason why that's the case is because you can give a person or people generally, but individual or corporately, all the information, all the raw data, all the facts that you want. The reality is that there are two grand factors that will determine how that plays out. One is the fact that, especially particularly on theological issues, without the work of the Holy Spirit, without the grace of God, that is to say, people are blinded, and the reason why they are blinded to those things is because of our own human condition. Okay, because of our own sin, because of our own ego, our own pride, our own arrogance, etc., all the way up and down the line. And those things distort the ability. So the kind of the myth of progressivism, right, that has prevailed for centuries is just that, and we've now got such an obvious demonstration of that with the rise of, with the advent publicly of the internet in the last 35 years now.
Yeah.
We have never had more information so readily available, and yet it's just objectively true from a comparative perspective that that there are those in the past who had a far better grip, even on I'm not talking about in like upper echelons of like ivory tower academics. I mean filtered down throughout society to the commons, who had a more developed ability for critical reasoning and thinking than we currently do.
Which brings me to the point, why didn't these Christians have that power of critical thinking and reasoning?
Right.
These,
they have a far more, not justifiable, but understandable reason. They have converted out of Greek paganism all of 5 minutes ago.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So them they are babies in the Christian faith, to use an analogy, right? They have not, they're not only are the congregants, but the men appointed as ministers over them, again, have not been Christians for all that long. Okay. Way shorter than what you would ever do today, but that's because when you're starting from zero, you can't just magically produce a guy with like 20 years of experience, because no one quite literally has 20 years of experience. It's not even 20 years since the resurrection. So
even the apostles are newbies.
Comparative. Yeah, the Gospels aren't even actually physically written. Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. It's all still spreading by word of mouth. Yeah, correct. Which is fine again, but also again, they had ancient people, well, not just ancient people, also medieval, pre-modern people had a way better retention for memory because of the oral culture. Yeah. So something being passed down orally does not automatically mean, it's just a game of Chinese whispers. No, it would be Chinese whispers today because we've lost that ability.
It's a lack of ignorance of just how accurate their oral recitation was.
Oh, correct. Yeah. Yes.
Most oral tradition would have been taught as specifically as we learn the times table.
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
Yeah. There's a specific, exactly, and there's a commitment to it, to memory, and not just the memory, but also then the understanding. Because you can engage in mnemonic processes to remember something as just a device, right? But then actually understanding what that means might be entirely different. But so it's both levels. It's not just actually recitation, but also actually an understanding. So because they actually understand the flow of the text and what it's about, they can remember the blah, blah, blah. Yeah, human beings the vast majority of Christians that have ever lived have had a much better ability to do that. And so, without divine revelation, without the grace of God, those things don't work. And so that's a plague we're currently suffering through. So let's move to the fourth and final point, which is much shorter than what we've been covering anyway. 2 times here in the end of verse 8 and the end of verse 9, we get this word which in English for you will either should be brought in as accursed. Mm-hmm. Does anyone have anything different at the end of verse 8 or verse 10 other than accursed? No? end of verse 8, end of verse 10.
I've got anathema.
Well, that's just, yeah, they've decided to just use the Greek word and transliterate it.
Okay, so anathema.
Means
I
accursed.
always thought that was something that was repulsive, but something that's an anathema.
Well, I suppose it's repulsive, I guess. We'll explain what it means, yeah.
Cheers.
So I'll read verses 8 and 9 in their total just to get the flow of it. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to the gospel that we have proclaimed to you, in other words, previously, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so I now again say, if any man is proclaiming to you a gospel contrary to what you received, let him be accursed. So the him, in other words, the men or even an angel, to use that hyperbolic statement of his, right, figure of speech, if anyone brings a gospel contrary to the one that has already been established, let him be accursed. Now, this is a Greek word, anathema, which has an interesting take. Historically speaking, the word anathema in the Hellenistic world meant that which was devoted. It was often used in the context of sacrifice. So something devoted to sacrifice in a temple, for example, could be described in the right context as anathema. In the Old Testament, in the Greek Old Testament, the word anathema is used in two different ways, and I'll come back to. Actually, no, I'll turn it first, and I'll go the other way. Is used in two different contexts. It's used for that which is offered up to God as an act of devotion, right, or worship, right, sacrifice, as well as that which is devoted to destruction. Okay, that which is offered almost as a sacrifice to the justice of God in destroying it. Okay, anathema, that which is offered up, right, devoted in that sense. That which is offered up is the literal sense of anathema. In the biblical context, it then takes that and runs with it in a certain direction. And it is namely and specifically, in the New Testament context, that is, in the negative aspect. So in this context, it's that which is offered up or that which is devoted to destruction or to judgment, okay? Hence why, so for example, in the Old Testament, as I mentioned earlier, anathema finds its way into the context of that which is given as devotion or offering up to God in sacrifice, temple things, etc., as well as that which is devoted to destruction, the Canaanite cities, for example, blah, blah. It's in that second vein that this word's being used, at least in terms of it's akin to that. Hence why we bring it, the best way that we have to bring it into English is accursed.
So would Sodom and Gomorrah be described as anathema?
It could be, yeah.
Okay.
Whether it is literally in that text, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at the
lexicon.
But conceptually, yes, it could be. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
It was sacrificed to the justice of God. Yeah, to the wrath of God.
This is so different to how I thought the word was actually used.
Interesting. And so fortunately, again, it's a word that is present elsewhere, and it was not. It's not a word that So, for example, this is not a hapax legomenon. This is not one. This is not which we've touched on before in our previous study. A hapax legomenon is a word that is only found once in a given text, like the scriptures. So sometimes there are words like that. Yeah. There are times every now and then where Paul uses a word that isn't used anywhere else in the Bible, and so we have to go outside of it to other Hellenistic sources, other ancient Greek sources, to try and find the understanding or the meaning of it. That happens, and that happens vice versa. Well, there are words that different Greek philosophers use that are not found anywhere else in their writings, and so you have to compare it to other things to get the meaning. This is not one of those cases. Anathema is well and widely understood. It takes on a certain meaning in the ecclesiastical context, so the church context, of devoting that. In this case, it's not actually just the belief, so the contrary gospel, it's the person, right? Let him, right, the false teacher, the heretic who tries to pervert you from the path of truth, let him be cursed by God, okay, for doing that, for leading you astray, right? For leading you down a path of lies, taking away from the path of truth.
Like
right?
it'd be better for him to have a millstone tied around his neck and thrown in the deepest part of the ocean.
Correct. In speaking of reference to those who corrupt children, that's what Christ's words are. Yeah, exactly. Yes, no, it would be better that he die. Yeah. And Paul himself actually ends up using a similar principle that's more contextually relevant in this context, where later on in this book he actually says it would be better for these people to castrate themselves if they're trying to push circumcision on these people.
Let's go extreme.
It'd be better if they did that to themselves and castrated themselves in the process and bled out and died. Now, why am I pointing this out? I'm pointing that out to tie you into this. He doesn't just say this, he actually doubles down. Verse 8 and verse 9 is just exactly the same. He repeats the same thing in verse 9. All right, I'll read it again, verse 8 and 9. Even if we are an angel from heaven, should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to the gospel we have proclaimed to you, let him be accursed. As we've said before, I now say again, if any man is proclaiming to you a gospel contrary to what you received, let him be accursed. So he doesn't just say it, he actually doubles down and says it again.
Just to make a big point of it,
Correct. Yeah, he's not apologising, he's not beating around the bush, he's not dancing on the subject. He calls down a curse upon the people, right? Not just the idea, so it's not just like nice and detached and remaining nice and friendly, buddy-buddy. No, the people. He's directly attacking the heretics. He calls down a curse upon them because of their lies and their manipulation and their abuse of brand new Christians in this context of the Galatians, and then doubles down on it, right? A, which he has authority to do, he's an apostle. B, he happens to be right. Again, this is a disaster if you're wrong, and it's actually sinful if you're wrong, so you've got to be extremely careful with this. This only works if you have rightful authority. In other words, it's in conformity with Scripture. That's the only context, and even then, he's not calling the curse down upon his fellow Christians, he's calling it upon the heretics. Okay?
It's doubly scary because both he and all the other apostles have proved through their miracles that they have the authority of God to actually talk about the gospel.
Yeah, correct. And they were eyewitnesses. They've seen this. They're not just some guy who heard it from some guy who heard it from some guy. There were many, but the defining criteria for an apostle was he had to have been an eyewitness to the resurrection, to the life and the resurrection. Not just the life, but the resurrection also. So it's not just coming from some who knows whatever, I had a dream and then blah, 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 right? It's actually someone physically saw it, right? It's grounded in the human experience and it's grounded in history and time and space, yeah? Exactly. And so he curses them. And he does it twice. He does it initially, and then just to make sure they really get the point and that he's not kidding, as I've said before, as we've said before, so it's the apostolic authority to say this, as we've said before, so I'm now saying to you again. Any man proclaims a different gospel, a distorted gospel, a gospel contrary to that which you received, let him be anathema, accursed. Anathema means, in the context of the church, an anathema, the pronouncing of an anathema is the most dire thing that can occur in Christianity. To be anathema is to be excommunicated from the church. That's what it's meant to be.
Right. But how I've seen it used colloquially is something that's repulsive or against, that God finds sin and anathema to his nature.
And that would certainly be true. The more immediate context of that word is usually the word that we bring into English as an abomination. For example, in the Old Testament, that's really the more direct way of saying that. Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Is an abomination. Yeah, it's something that's contrary to nature. It's contrary to the order of how God has created the world to operate. Yeah. It stands in enmity against the first book that God wrote, which was the creation of the cosmos itself.
So to hear it used this way, to me, is quite novel.
In our sense, yeah, it's certainly, because it has a specific context. The word itself isn't novel, but its application here is is a newer development in a contextual way, would be the way of putting it. Yeah. Okay. And establishes the pattern for how that word is to now be used. And this is not the only time. Again, languages develop and evolve over time, right? Every single language has. English has obviously moved through Old English into Middle English, into Early Modern English, into Late Modern English, into Contemporary English. Okay, words, what they mean now. They've meant that for ages. There are words that have multiple meanings, what they used to mean and what they mean now, and there are other words that have completely polar opposite, changed what they mean entirely. Right? That's just how words are. That's just the normal evolution of human language.
Yeah.
For those who have been in our church history classes, when we were looking at the term hypostasis in relation to the Nicene Creed and elsewhere, that word in more ancient Hellenistic sources meant something different than what it came to mean in church Greek, essentially, in the Greek that was used in the ecclesiastical context, the church context, in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, where now it came to mean being or person. Again, even that's a complex distinction with regards to the word person, but anyway, we've covered that in church history lessons. And so language evolves, and you can't just come up with a brand new meaning of what things do and don't mean. That's half the issue with what we deal with now with the debates that rage over personal pronouns and other such things. You can't just simply decide that they can now be flagrantly and widely used in the singular form, because that's not how that pronoun has ever worked outside of the rarest of contexts. You can't just simply invent meanings. They need to evolve and develop organically and naturally in conformity with truth. In this context, this is not just out of the blue novel. It's along the lines of again, remember I said there was a positive and a negative context to that word in its Old Testament context? Mm-hmm. It's in conformity with that negative context. Mm-hmm. So that which is devoted to destruction, right? That which judgment befalls, and that which is wiped out by God's justice, right? That doesn't stand the test of time, right? That's the context here. So he's calling to curse these people. He is calling down a curse from heaven. He is calling on God to bring justice against those who pervert the truth and who therefore promote lies. Yeah.
So that would apply not just to this, but like Arianism,
exactly. Yes. Well, yeah, it did apply to Arianism. So the original the version of the Nicene Creed that we use is the version that was codified and expanded at the Council of Constantinople in 381, right? And that's the version that every Christian's been using basically since, other than with the later dispute about the filioque, but that's another subject. The original version from 325, which was updated and the expanded and enhanced version later improved, that original version actually finished with an anathema against the Arians, okay? And rightfully so. It's the appropriate context, it's a conciliar setting, so church council, blah, blah, totally justifiable and right. And so that actually, they removed that wording from the next one only because, from the updated, expanded, enhanced version, because of the purpose of the creed. The anathema still stood, like it wasn't like they got rid, but the literal word wasn't included any longer in the creed, because the creed had a specific purpose to it. Yeah. And so yes, anathemas. Anathemas are something that must be administered as the last port of call, essentially, and must be done so by rightful authorities upon the right basis. The issue is that anathemas have at many times throughout church history, anathemas have been thrown around as if they were going out of fashion, and anathemas have just been hurled left, right, and centre, like kids having a snowball fight, and that usually just becomes a bit of a dumpster fire. The Bishop of Rome and the bishops of Rome and the bishops of Constantinople have hurled so many anathemas at each other, you'd have more of an easier time finding out who has not thrown an anathema at one another. And so those things, again, that's just that's just the faults of us as humans, not of God. But alas, they have their rightful, appropriate place. But the bigger point to see here, especially between verse 8 and 9, the doubling down, is that it circles back to us. Ironically, this actually circles back to our very beginning point, which was the omission of not giving the usual salutation of how much he thanks God for them and how often, reminding them, telling them how often he prays for them, blah, 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 just diving straight into a criticism. I marvel at how quickly you have deserted Jesus Christ, blah, blah, blah. Because it's entirely it lays such an obvious foundation for what then comes, which is that there's nothing soft and polite about this letter at all, really. He doesn't begin by telling them, reminding them how much he loves them, reminding them how much he prays for them, etc., etc. It's not that he doesn't love them and that he doesn't pray for them. If he didn't love, you're correct. If he didn't love them, he wouldn't be wasting his time writing this letter. Yeah. That's assumed. But he's not. Now's not the time for reminding them of all the nice soft sensibilities, which have their appropriate context. This is not the time for it. He dives right into a sarcastic criticism of them. I marvel as to how quickly you've deserted Christ over this stuff, and then doubles down on cursing the heretics. He doesn't just say it once; he doubles down again and uses the exact same phrase and word again. And the temptation is to think that Paul is hot-headed, that Paul is mean, that he's mean-spirited, that he's unchristian, that he's not nice enough, he's not kind enough. But what no one will actually be able to successfully accuse him of is being a liar. Hence why he then says in verse 10, "For am I now seeking the favour of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men?" The rhetorical answer to that is no. If I was still trying to please men, if I was still trying to be buddy-buddy with everyone, if I was still trying to be a people person, as we might say, then I would not be a slave to Christ. I wouldn't be a servant of Jesus. Right?
Which is part of the thing that all the apostles went to their death.
Absolutely.
Still believing that this really, really happened.
Absolutely correct. And they tried to kill John. It didn't work for him, and so he eventually just dies of old age.
Yeah.
But all the apostles had attempts on their life, and all of them were successful with the exception of John. And that's the basis of it. Again, so the final real point here is that, and it ties back to that point we're making about truth, is one of the other big we talked about the metaphysics of truth, so we talked about the ontology of truth, ontology meaning the nature of it. The other side then is also the purpose of truth, the telos, the teleology of truth, right? The purpose or the end goal of truth. Often, very often in fact, at different times, including in our time, people will take 1,000 different exceptions to something truthful that's been said upon all kinds of grounds that actually have no bearing upon whether or not the statement was true. The more common ways in our time that we do this, that's more contextually relevant to us, is that it's a taking of umbrage against the way in which something was said. Right? Someone says XYZ thing that's true. Objectively true, factually true, demonstrably true, like you can demonstrate the evidence of it being true. And the person opposing it will come back and say, "Well, I don't like the sound of that. I don't like the sound of that." Or "I don't like that." What that has to do with the price of tea in China would be anyone's guess, because "I don't like the sound of it" means nothing. It means nothing. "I don't like the sound of it" means in reality means I don't like that this thing is true, because I don't want it to be true.
It's a you problem, not a me problem.
Correct. It's a you problem. It's not a problem with the truth, with the me problem, exactly. With the thing that was said that was truthful. I don't like the sound of that has not even the faintest iota of a bearing on whether or not what was said was true at all in any capacity. It's not an argument. It's literally nothing. It's a whinge.
Yeah.
And even me describing it as that sounds mean-spirited. But again, the question is not, does this sound mean? The question is, is this true? And the reality is that it is. It's a whinge. It's a complaint. It's not a statement of whether or not it's true. When someone says, I don't like the sound of that, they're not saying anything other than ranting about how they feel about the thing that was just said. And so in this context here, those who, because so many people, the letter to the Galatians is routinely pointed to by those who are enemies of the church and enemies of Paul, even within the church, as to why Paul should be disregarded on all the kinds of different things that he says, because Paul has the most direct, obviously Paul has the greatest volume of writing in the New Testament, and so he has the most to say about a whole bunch of things related to Christian life and the church and et cetera, et cetera. And so chopping down Paul necessarily, by extension, chops down a lot of the New Testament, right? So he's always been target number one. Going all the way back to even to ancient times, Paul's always been target number one, because if you can dispel Paul, you can dispel a big bulk of the New Testament. And routinely in our time is Paul identified as being harsh and angry and mean. And
So that's just saying I didn't like what he said.
Exactly. All that's saying is I don't like what he said, which is back to my previous point. I don't like what he said means I don't like that this is true, because I believe and view and want to do something else different than this. I believe something else, and I don't want that to be true. When someone says, I don't like the sound of that, or anything else to the akin to that in whatever phraseology, what that actually in reality means is I don't like that thing you said is true. That's what that means.
But okay. I mean, what he's saying is absolutely right down the line of scripture, because we're called to be the light on the hill, the salt of the earth, to follow Christ as being the source of truth.
Who is the truth? Yeah, exactly.
So
who is truth?
We should be expected as bondservants to talk truth, no matter how unpopular it is.
Correct. Yes. Especially, exactly, 100%, and especially on these things, along with all things. And so the I don't like that, or I don't like the sound of that, or that was mean-spirited. You didn't say, or that was unchristian-like. That wasn't Christ-like. All of those things are absolutely and patently irrelevant. Yeah. The mean-spirited, because again, the mean-spiritedness of something is even when someone says, "Oh, that was mean-spirited." If it's true and it was said in a mean-spirited way, if being the emphasis of the word there, that's a subjective declaration. Okay, you're subjectively declaring that you personally found that to be mean-spirited, which, with respect, is largely an act of clairvoyance. Because
how would you know what I'm thinking?
Right, correct. And therefore has no real meaningful basis or substance in reality, right? It again also is empty words that mean nothing. Just like I don't like the sound of that really means nothing. It does mean something. It actually in reality means I don't like that that's true. Hence why the words I don't like the sound of that mean nothing, right?
I cop this in the shop all the time, right? You know, don't actually speak to the truth of what that person's trying to distort, because we'll lose sales.
Sure.
And I go, no, I've got to speak to the truth because
correct. And there's all kinds of things where there's no, and again, these things exist outside of just church settings. Yeah, there's all kinds of things.
You know, global warming, or cashless society.
All that, various different things. I mean, medical people will know full well. Again, both of you worked in medical sectors. That those who are struggling with or especially if someone dies in an emergency department, or if there is someone who has news being revealed about cancer, etc., there is no nice way of saying your husband just died on the operating table. There is no nice way. There's no way of saying There's no way of telling someone that their husband just died on the operating table in a way that will not result in them being heartbroken. Okay? That doesn't exist. And so the only way to deliver that news is detached and objectively in a calm yet straightforward manner, not beating around the bush, not watering down what's happened, not trying to...
There's a good joke on that line, you know, the guy rings up after he's been away, oh, how's my cat? Oh, it died. Oh, you shouldn't have told me that way, that's devastating. You should have said it got up onto the roof and we tried to rescue it and it didn't work out. Yeah. Oh, okay, then, well, your grandmother got up on the roof.
Yeah, correct, yeah. Right, exactly. And there's just no way, because the reality is just the reality of what it is, right? The perception of how something was said is such a astonishingly subjective venture that it immediately arrives at the point of irrelevancy. It's so subjective, because so I can stand next, and I've had this experience all the time. If I can try and defend myself at least briefly, I don't think through any fault of my own. If I'm having to communicate something in a straightforward manner about something serious, at 6'4" with a relatively deeper voice, that's going to come across a certain way than if Lisa said it. Not to pick on you, right? It just is. Yeah, it just is through no fault of my own or her own or anyone else's own. Yeah. It just is the reality of what it is. So there's no way to actually objectively control that. And then also at the same time, I can say the exact same thing in the exact same way about the exact same subject to one person, and they find it mean, or they find all those kinds of words that get into it. And I can say the exact same thing in the exact same way on the exact same subject to someone else, and they're totally fine about it, which is the very evidence of the subjectivity I'm talking about. Do you know what I mean? This would go for any one of us. It's just the reality of how humans work. So the subjective elements just are irrelevant, right? I don't like the sound of that, or those kinds of other phrases that we tend to use. Oh, that was mean-spirited. Oh, that's un-Christ-like. Oh, that's mean. You blah, blah, blah. Are all entirely irrelevant, because there is no way of objectively grounding those things. There's just not. And even more obviously, I don't like the sound of that, and all of its derivations means I don't like that is true. That's what's really going on there.
But that's what he's saying here. But I'm a bondservant of Christ, you know.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
There's no way that I can say it any other way.
Yeah, correct. And so what this teaches us, again, other than the other lessons, is that this teaches us that the plain commitment to speaking truth is in itself a righteous venture, right? Now, obviously, again, like I mentioned this earlier, and this is how this wraps up for us. There is obviously wisdom being employed, right? So there are times where, for example, we were mentioning police interrogations earlier and stuff about lies. When a particularly brutal crime has occurred, is it necessary that the family of the victim know every single last detail about what happened to that family member during a horrific murder? The answer is no. In fact, 99% of the time, they are better off not knowing every single last gruesome detail to the specific letter of how exactly that played out, because it's not even just a point of diminishing returns. It's a point of no returns at all. There's no added benefit to knowing all the additional level of the horrors of that murder, right? So the basics cover it. Now, are you lying to them? Not in that context. You're not lying to them. You're no less lying to them than an intelligence officer is lying to the enemy country that he's in by pretending to not be a spy for such and such, for Australia, right? Or the soldiers on the battlefield wearing camouflage combat uniforms. They're not lying to their enemy, and therefore they're violating the commandments against bearing false witness. No, because deception has different contexts in which it works, depending on intent, right? But the point being is, to circle back to this, is that the seriousness of this matter that's being addressed in this letter demands plain truth, bold truth, unapologetically spoken, with no compromise, no apology, right? The second you apologise for having spoken the truth, but in a way that someone else took umbrage to because I don't like how you said that, or whatever its derivations, the second you apologise, in our current time in the 21st century, where this stuff is where this stuff is a real big problem for us, the second you apologise, you lose forever. Okay? If you have not told the truth, if you have lied, blah, 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 then apologies are obviously naturally in order. But if someone hasn't lied, if you haven't lied and the other person's calling you names, they're calling you a this, they're calling you a that, again, all these terms get hoisted around these days. Again, even remotely sticking to the biblical position on sexuality and marriage will immediately get you deemed a homophobe or a transphobe or a this, that, and other, right? Which are all utterly meaningless, made-up terms. No, you're not, okay? You don't hate this person or that person. You're telling them the truth and never apologise for it. Because the second you apologise for it, they will destroy you and you will never recover, okay? People's lives are destroyed in our time because people essentially act like the mafia and threaten to cancel and threaten to railroad and threaten to destroy people's livelihoods by telling the truth. And Christians need to buckle down and to actually have this kind of clarity and conviction to tell the truth and not apologise for telling the truth.
But also say at the same time, like Jesus accepted everybody
Correct.
wherever they were at, I accept you.
Yeah, and now let's walk for, exactly.
Yeah.
And the gospel can redeem anyone no matter where they're at. Exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's only through truth that is displayed.
Because it takes away that power. You're judging me. No, I'm not judging you. I accept you.
Yeah, I'm not judging you. Like Jesus says, we already stand condemned.
Yeah.
You already stand condemned. We all stand. You already stand condemned. I'm not. I don't need to judge you and condemn you. You already stand condemned, just as I once stood condemned.
Yeah.
But Christ has come to redeem those who at one point stand condemned. Yeah. Never apologise for telling the truth. Cool. Thank you. That's the end of the lesson.
Thank you.
For some.
For some.
Next lesson will obviously continue on. Yes, correct. Yes. That would be one of those subjective statements I was previously referring to. So, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.